Hello, I'm Maria Barontini, Pastoral Associate of Children's Catechesis at Prince of Peace. This week, the readings for Sunday, July 19th are Wisdom, chapter 12, verse 13 and verse 16 through 19, Psalm 86, Romans 8, 26 through 27, and Matthew 13, verse 24 through 43. Remember that last week we talked about the parables, and again we're going to talk about a parable or several parables in the Matthew 13, 24 through 43. But I want to remind us, in case you haven't seen that video, that a parable is a way Jesus taught people. It's a short story that teaches us something, and we need to reflect on it to understand it. The gospel reading is Matthew 13, 24 through 30, or Matthew 13, 24 through 43. In the shortened gospel, it only talks about the gospel or the parable of the good seed and the weeds. But in the longer gospel reading, it includes that parable plus the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the yeast, and then the explanation that Jesus gives to the disciples. So at that time, the setting of the story is Jesus is talking to a large crowd, and they go off, and Jesus explains it. So depending on which of the readings is said at Mass, you may hear just the parable of the good seed and the weeds, or you may hear the whole thing. So I'm going to briefly talk about the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail with the parable of the good seed and the weed. The parable of the mustard seed and the yeast illustrate the exact same point, so we're going to talk about them together. It's the amazing contrast between the small beginnings of the kingdom and its expansion. So what that means is a mustard seed is super duper tiny. If you've ever seen yeast, if you've ever baked with your mom or dad, a piece of yeast is so tiny. It's about the size of a piece of sand. So if you imagine a piece of sand, that's about the size of a piece of yeast. And when you use yeast and you add it to certain things, it expands and makes it really big. Like I was making bread today, and I put barely any yeast in this particular thing I was making, and it's already a big bowl, and I'm still making it and using it and making it bigger each time I flip it and knead it. So that is what Jesus is telling us about. This is what his point is. His point is that there can be a small beginning, but it can become really big. And it's talking about the church and how it expands and how the word of God has been spread throughout this world. So think about it this way. Think about the disciples. They're only a small group of people, but they told others about Jesus, and those others told others about Jesus. And those disciples were our first priests and apostles and bishops. And there's been all these people after them to the point that we have the Catholic Church today. And you realize how big that is. So small beginnings, big expansion. So that's what the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the yeast are talking about. It's showing us that a small beginning can be huge. So moving on to the gospel or the parable of the good seed and the weeds, I'm going to show you a book. It's a comic book style illustration of the parable of the good seed and the weeds. It's a good summary for us. It doesn't tell us everything that the Bible has written about this, so I still recommend you read Matthew 13, 24 through 43, the whole thing on your own. But this will give you the summary so we can discuss it a little further. So I'm going to show you this book. It's the Illustrated Parables of Jesus for Children. So let me show it to you. So we've got the Illustrated Parables of Jesus for Children. This is produced by Ignatius and Magnificat, and you can find this definitely on Ignatius Press's website, but I think you can also find it on the Magnificat website if you're interested in purchasing one of these. This is great, especially if your children like, or if you like an illustrated comic book style book. So here we go. I'm going to try my best to show this to you and read it to you. It's real quick, but then it'll give us the ability to talk about it further. The good seed and the weeds. Jesus tells the crowd this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sows good seed in his field. During the night, his enemy comes and sows weeds all through the wheat. When the wheat begins to grow, the weeds appear as well. Where have these weeds come from? An enemy has done this. Do you want us to pull them up? No, you might uproot the wheat at the same time. Let them grow together until the harvest. Then I will tell the harvesters, pull up the weeds first and burn them. Then reap the wheat and gather it into my barn. So, what does this parable teach us? Well, Jesus tells the disciples in his explanation of this story that the man who sows good seed in the story is the Son of Man. So it's him, it's Jesus. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, so those that follow Jesus. And the weeds are the children of the evil one. The enemy in the story is the devil. The harvest that will happen to all of us at the end of time, the harvest is what will happen to us at the end of time. We will be separated just like the good harvest and the weeds are in this story. At the end of time, we'll be separated by who we follow. Do we follow the sower of the seeds or the enemy? Who do you follow? And the question for all of us then becomes, are you a good seed or a weed? Also notice that when just the parable is told, it emphasizes patience while they wait for the seeds and the weeds to grow. Jesus shows us patience and multiple opportunities throughout our lives to turn to him and avoid being collected with the weeds. That's free will. That's the gift of free will right there. We need to remember this happens at the end of time. So we might be surrounded by individuals in our lives who make good and bad choices, and we still have time to change our ways and reach heaven to be collected with the good harvest.